Hey everyone, I noticed a lot of you who are watching and enjoying the content aren't subscribed yet. If you love spine-chilling stories, creepy encounters, and unexplained mysteries, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on the next terrifying upload. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you more of the content you love. I've had my fair share of awkward first dates, but none of them even come close to the one I had at the movie theater. You know how they say, you'll never forget your first date? Yeah, I'll never forget this one, but for all the wrong reasons. If I could take it back, I would. But that night still haunts me. It all started out pretty normal. I met this girl Lucy through a mutual friend. She was cute, and we hit it off right away. We decided on a late-night movie for our first date. Nothing too fancy, just two people watching a film, grabbing a bite to eat afterward, and calling it a night. The perfect low-stakes kind of date. At least that's what I thought. We'd been texting back and forth for a couple of days, and we both agreed that a late-night showing would be nice. It was a smaller theater, one of those places that wasn't super popular, but it had a certain charm to it. You know the kind, old school with creaky floors, dim lights, and a weird smell of popcorn lingering in the air. But it was perfect for a first date, something quiet where we could talk without the noise of a packed theater. I picked her up at her place, and we made our way to the theater. We didn't talk much on the way there, not because there was any weird tension, but because the drive was kind of long, and we were both tired from a long day. I could tell she was excited, though. She had that kind of nervous energy, the kind that you get when you're looking forward to something but also hoping it doesn't turn into a disaster. I felt the same way. It was our first date. Who knows how it would go? We walked in, and everything seemed normal. The movie wasn't starting for another 20 minutes, so we had time to grab our tickets and head to the concession stand. We joked about which snacks to get, popcorn, candy, the usual, and eventually made our way into the theater itself. The first weird thing I noticed was how empty it was. I mean, I knew it was a late showing, but the place was completely deserted, not a single person sitting anywhere in the whole theater. It was just us. I looked over at Lucy. She didn't seem bothered by it, so I thought maybe it was just a quiet night. Still, I couldn't shake the weird feeling that the emptiness gave me. The kind of empty that feels like it's almost too empty. You know what I mean? Like, you expect to see more people, but you don't. It's unsettling. We picked a couple of seats about halfway up, kind of right in the middle of the room. I didn't think anything of it, but as I sat down, I couldn't shake the weird vibe of the place. The walls were covered in these old, faded movie posters from the 90 seconds, and the dim lighting from the aisle didn't help the atmosphere. It was like something out of a low-budget horror movie, but I figured it was just my imagination. Lucy was acting totally normal, laughing and chatting about some of the previews we had just seen. I could tell she was in a good mood, but I kept glancing around. The silence was almost too loud, if that makes sense. I felt like I could hear my heartbeat, the way you can when everything else is quiet. The theater itself was old, definitely not one of those shiny new multiplexes. The floors creaked under our feet as we walked, and the air was thick with that familiar mix of popcorn butter and dust. The lighting was dim and yellow, and everything had this faded vintage vibe. I didn't mind it at first, but now that we were sitting there alone, it felt more eerie than charming. We settled in, chatting a little, and then the previews started. It felt like any other night at the movies, but when the main feature started, that's when things started to go south. I was sitting there, eyes glued to the screen, but something felt off. It wasn't the movie itself, it was the sound. In the quiet of the theater, there was a faint whispering coming from behind us. It was subtle at first, so I thought maybe it was just the air conditioning or some noise from the speakers. But then it came again, clearer this time. It wasn't just one voice, it was multiple voices, whispering in low, urgent tones. I looked around, the seats behind us were empty. I turned to Lucy, trying to keep my cool. "Did you hear that?" I asked, but she was too focused on the screen to even notice. I didn't push it. She was into the movie, and I didn't want to ruin the moment by acting weird. But that didn't stop the whispers. I tried to focus on the film, but the soft murmuring kept pulling me away. I tried to ignore it, but the whispers kept coming, more persistent now. They sounded like they were right behind me, like someone was standing just a few inches away, talking in hushed voices. I felt my heart rate pick up, but I didn't want to seem like a freak on our first date, so I just kept my eyes on the screen. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, but I told myself it was just the atmosphere playing tricks on me. As the movie went on, the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder. The voices were no longer subtle. They were clearer, closer, more insistent. I could hear words now, but none of them made sense. They didn't seem to be talking to me, but they were talking about me. I could hear the faintest sound of my name being whispered, but every time I tried to catch it, it would slip away, like a fleeting thought. I turned around again, trying to get a glimpse of who was behind me, but the seats were still empty. Nothing. Just shadows in the dim light. My pulse started to race, and I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck. The whispers were growing more frantic now, like something or someone was trying to get my attention. I glanced at Lucy, and she still hadn't noticed anything. She was completely absorbed in the movie, completely oblivious to the strange, unsettling sounds behind us. I tried to focus on the film again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whispering wasn't just noise. It felt intentional, like someone was trying to communicate with me. The movie dragged on, and by this point, I was no longer following the plot. My mind kept drifting back to the whispers. The air felt thick with something unspoken, like the walls themselves were closing in. I looked back again, my body tense, but I couldn't see anything, just empty seats and shadows stretching out in the darkness. A few more minutes passed, and the whispers started to take on a more distinct tone. They were almost like laughter, but muffled, like someone was trying to hold it in. It made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, but then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the sound of a chair creaked behind me. I froze. I had been listening so intently I was almost sure I could feel the weight of someone sitting right there just behind my seat. But when I turned around, the chairs were still empty. My heart was racing now. I couldn't take it anymore. I leaned over to Lucy and whispered, trying not to sound too panicked, "Hey, are you sure we're the only ones in here?" She glanced at me, looking a little confused, but smiled and nodded. "Yeah, why? It's kind of nice, isn't it?" I smiled back, but it felt forced. I didn't want to freak her out, but the situation was starting to feel impossible to ignore. Something was wrong, and I was sure I wasn't just hearing things. The whispering continued, but now it wasn't just voices. There were other sounds too, faint rustling, like the movement of something in the dark. The air in the theater felt heavier, almost suffocating. I tried to concentrate on the movie, but my mind kept slipping back to the whispers, the shadows in the empty seats, the strange feeling of being watched. That's when I heard it, a faint, guttural sound, like someone was trying to choke back a laugh. It was coming from directly behind me now. My body went cold, and I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I turned around once more, my heart hammering in my chest. But again the seats were empty. There was no one there, except there was something strange. The floor. It was wet, like something had been spilled, but there were no drinks or popcorn containers around. Just wet patches, like footprints had been left behind in the aisle, but no one had walked by. I couldn't stay in that theater a second longer. I grabbed Lucy's hand, practically yanking her up from her seat. She was startled, but I didn't care. I wasn't about to sit through whatever this was. We hurried out of the theater, and the door slammed shut behind us with a loud thud. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was behind us, what we had just escaped. The whole walk back to my car felt like a blur, my mind too focused on the fact that we had been the only ones in that theater, and yet I had heard voices, movement, things that shouldn't have been there. We didn't talk much after that. Lucy seemed confused, maybe even a little annoyed that I'd rushed her out so suddenly, but she didn't press me for answers. I don't think she understood the weight of what had happened, what I had felt. As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't really left the theater, that something had followed us out. The whispers kept echoing in my mind, a reminder that whatever it was in that theater, it wasn't finished with me yet. I haven't been back to that theater since, and I'm not sure I ever will. It's a strange feeling, knowing there's a place out there that doesn't make sense, that feels like it shouldn't exist. But the whispers, they still haunt me. Even now, when it's quiet, I swear I hear them. Maybe they were never really gone after all. I'll never forget the night I met Amia. It was supposed to be just a regular night out. A couple of drinks, some good conversation, and maybe a laugh or two. Instead, it turned into something that felt like stepping into another world, a world that I don't ever want to revisit. It started like any normal Saturday night. I was at a bar downtown with my friends, just trying to kill time. I didn't expect anything to come of it, but then she walked in. Amia. She was sitting alone at the bar when I noticed her. There was something magnetic about her, an ease about the way she sat there, sipping her drink, like she was completely comfortable in her own skin. I wasn't expecting it, but we started talking, and before I knew it, we were laughing and swapping stories like we'd known each other forever. She was funny, mysterious in a way that didn't make me feel uneasy, and just a little bit strange in the best way. I was hooked. By the end of the night, I was definitely tipsy, and she invited me to her apartment. I didn't think anything of it at first. It seemed like a logical next step. So I followed her out, and we walked to her place. When we got to her building, I immediately noticed something off about it. It was older, a little run down, the kind of building that had seen better days but still had some charm. Amia didn't seem bothered by it, so I figured it was just part of the vibe she was going for. She led me up the stairs, and when she opened the door to her apartment, I felt a strange chill run down my spine. The place was empty. There was furniture, but it was so stark, so cold. No photos on the walls, no personal belongings, not even a mug or a piece of clothing out of place. It felt like a hotel room, one where no one had ever truly stayed. She didn't seem fazed by it at all. It was like she lived in a completely different world, one where nothing was familiar or grounded in reality. I sat down on the couch, trying to push through the awkwardness, but the feeling of unease kept creeping up on me. I tried to keep the conversation going, but she kept answering my questions with vague, robotic responses. It was like trying to talk to someone who wasn't really there, who wasn't present. I kept asking myself, what the hell is going on here? She went into another room, her bedroom I assumed, and I stayed on the couch, my mind spinning. I didn't know what was bothering me more, the emptiness of the apartment or the odd way she acted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I got up, and against my better judgment, I walked toward the hallway. I wasn't sure why, but I felt this overwhelming need to see more of the apartment. When I stepped into the bedroom, I froze. The walls were covered in scratches, not the kind you'd expect from a rough night or something careless. These were deep gouges, like someone had been scratching and clawing at the walls for years. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Why the hell would someone do that? What did it mean? That's when I heard her, Amia. I didn't hear her footsteps, but I felt her presence behind me, cold and silent. When I turned around, she was standing there, her eyes different. Her smile was gone. She looked almost vacant, like she wasn't there at all. You shouldn't be here, she whispered, her voice sending a chill down my spine. I didn't say anything back. I couldn't. Something inside me screamed that I needed to leave, but before I could take a step, she spoke again. You're not real, she said, her voice breaking through the silence. The words sent an electric jolt through me, and everything in that moment felt like it was crumbling apart. I didn't stop to think. I turned around and bolted for the door. My mind was racing, my heart was pounding, and my only thought was getting out of that apartment, away from her, away from whatever strange reality I had stepped into. When I finally made it outside, I didn't look back. I didn't want to. I just kept walking, not caring about anything but putting as much distance as I could between myself and that place. I didn't hear from Amia again, and for the next few days I tried to forget everything. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad night, some weird offbeat experience that would fade with time. But the thing was, it didn't fade. The feeling of her words haunted me. You're not real. I couldn't shake it. What did she mean? Was I even real? That's when the second twist came. 3 days after that night, I was at work when I got a text from an unknown number. My stomach dropped when I saw the message, "Come find me." At first I thought it was a prank. Maybe one of my friends was messing with me. But when I checked the number, there was nothing familiar about it. I tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail, and when I tried sending a text, it was blocked. I started to feel the first stirrings of panic. This wasn't a joke. I went back to Amia's building. I don't know why. I guess I was trying to make sense of it all. But when I got there, everything felt wrong. The building looked abandoned. The lights in the hallway were flickering, and the air was thick with dust, like no one had been inside for years. I stepped inside, hoping to find some clue, but when I knocked on her door, there was no answer. I waited for what felt like hours. Nothing. No sign of Amia, no sign of anyone. Just an empty, silent hallway, and then it hit me. The building, the apartment, Amia herself. I pulled out my phone, desperate to find something, anything. I searched for the building's history, hoping to find a simple answer. But what I found made my blood run cold. The building had been condemned years ago after a fire, and all the tenants had been evacuated. It had been abandoned for nearly a decade. I was staring at the screen when something strange caught my eye. There was an old article, buried deep in the results, about the fire that destroyed the upper floors. The article mentioned a woman named Amia, one of the last residents of the building. She'd disappeared shortly before the fire, and no one had ever heard from her again. Her case had never been solved. Amia disappeared. I wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Had I really met her, or was I just a part of something that wasn't real? A fragment of a story that didn't make sense? But what shook me the most wasn't the story. It was the last line of the article. The woman's last known whereabouts were in the building's basement. I looked down the hallway towards the stairs that led to the basement. The same stairs I'd walked up just days before. I didn't need to go down there. But some dark part of me wanted to. I didn't know if it was curiosity or something worse, something pulling me toward the unknown. But I didn't go. And now, weeks later, I haven't heard from her again. No more texts, no more strange calls. But I can't forget her. I can't forget the apartment, the scratches, her face when she told me I wasn't real. I'm not sure if I ever really met Amia, or if I was just lost in a place that doesn't exist anymore. But whatever the truth is, I don't want to know. Some things are better left in the past. And as for Amia, I think I'll keep that mystery to myself. I just pray I never hear from her again. It was supposed to be just another casual date, one of those meet up and see how it goes kind of things. I hadn't been on many dates recently. Life had been busy, and I figured I'd give online dating another try. I had been talking to Laura for a few weeks. Her profile was everything I wanted: fun, easygoing, into the same hobbies, with a quirky sense of humor that I liked. After all the small talk through texts, we finally decided to meet in person. I suggested we meet at a local bar, nothing too fancy. A quiet place where you could still hear yourself talk, not too loud, but with just enough ambiance to feel relaxed. I wasn't expecting anything dramatic, just a good evening with a new person. What happened, though, was far beyond anything I could have prepared for. When I got there, I saw her immediately. She was sitting at a table near the back, right where she said she'd be. She was even more beautiful in person, but there was something strange about her. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a feeling that lingered. She looked normal. Her long brown hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her green eyes sparkled under the dim lighting. But the longer I looked at her, the more my gut told me something was off. We exchanged pleasantries as I sat down, both of us a little nervous, but that was expected. The awkwardness at first felt normal, but it didn't take long before I began noticing things. At first it was just little things, so small that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Her voice was softer than expected, almost like it was coming from further away, as though it were filtered through something. It wasn't loud enough to be unsettling, but it was enough to make me feel slightly on edge. We started talking about trivial things, our favorite movies, hobbies, work, but with every passing sentence, it was like there was a veil between us. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just the way her words felt a little too distant. Not like she was distracted, but more like she wasn't truly there. Her eyes were always on me, but they didn't quite focus. They darted back and forth, scanning me, yet never landing where they should. I tried to ignore it. After all, it was a first date. Of course, things might feel a little strange at first, right? Maybe I was just too nervous. So I laughed off my discomfort and kept the conversation flowing. Then it happened. As I looked at her, I realized her face wasn't quite right. It was subtle, but it bothered me. The longer I stared, the more it seemed like her features weren't in the right place. It was as if her face was shifting, but not in a dramatic, supernatural way, more like a small glitch. I couldn't pin it down. Her eyes didn't sit quite right. Her mouth looked a little too wide, and her nose seemed too small for her face. The more I blinked, the more I felt like I was looking at someone else entirely. But when I blinked again, everything returned to normal. She looked like the woman I had seen in her photos. Nothing out of the ordinary. I chalked it up to my imagination. Maybe it was the dim lighting in the bar, or maybe I had too much to drink, I told myself. I tried to focus on her words again. But every time I glanced away, I had this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. And every time I looked back, I could feel the unease settling in my chest like a weight. Her smile was too wide. Her eyes, though beautiful, didn't quite align with her face. I couldn't stop looking at them, trying to figure out what was wrong, but every time I blinked, they would return to normal. It was disorienting. I started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality, as if I were trapped in some twisted dream. Was I imagining it all? Was it the alcohol messing with my head? But then she did something that made everything feel even more wrong. She leaned in closer, not a little close, but just enough that I could feel her breath on my skin. Her lips parted, and she whispered something I couldn't hear at first. It was like her voice had changed, deepened, and I could feel it in my bones. "You saw it, didn't you?" I froze. My heart stopped for a second, and everything around me seemed to blur. The noise in the bar faded. The people talking at other tables turned into muffled murmurs. All I could focus on was her face, which now seemed to twist and contort, the features moving just a little too much, as if they were no longer fully attached to her face. I couldn't respond. I didn't even know how to react. My mind raced. What did she mean by that? What was I supposed to have seen? Was this part of some twisted joke, or was I losing my mind? Her smile widened. her teeth just a little too sharp, her eyes gleaming with something dark. I couldn't tell if it was a smirk or something more sinister, but it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded awkwardly, pretending like I understood, but I had no idea what was going on anymore. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like jelly. My heart raced, and I was sure I was about to pass out. I needed to leave. I didn't know what was happening, but the only thing I could think about was getting out of that bar. I excused myself quickly, muttering something about needing to get some fresh air, and stood up. The room seemed to shift as I walked toward the door. The world felt too heavy, like everything was pressing in on me. I needed air. I needed to get away from her. As I reached the door, I glanced back at her one last time. She was still sitting there, watching me leave, her head tilted slightly, as if she were studying me. Her eyes, those eyes, followed me as I stepped into the cool night air. The door closed behind me, and the sounds of the bar faded, but the unsettling feeling didn't go away. I walked down the street, trying to clear my head. What the hell had just happened? Had I been set up? Was she playing a prank on me? I tried to shake it off, but the more I walked, the more the image of her face haunted me. Her eyes, her mouth, her voice, none of it made sense. It felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I called a cab, trying to focus on something normal, something I could hold on to. The cab ride home was quiet, the driver barely saying a word, and I appreciated the silence. But my mind wouldn't stop racing. I couldn't stop thinking about what she said. You saw it, didn't you? I felt like I was supposed to know what she meant, but I didn't. I was too confused, too rattled, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what it was. I made it home, but sleep didn't come easy that night. I kept tossing and turning, replaying the entire evening over and over. Her face, her words, her voice, it all kept cycling through my mind. I knew I needed answers, but part of me was terrified of finding them. What if I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see? What if I had stumbled into something that wasn't meant for me? Days passed, and I tried to put the whole thing behind me. I blocked her number, deleted her profile, and made a conscious effort to move on. But it didn't work. The feeling that something was wrong stuck with me like a stain I couldn't wash away. I started seeing her face in the crowd, in the windows of passing cars, in every shadow, her eyes always following me. I never saw her again, but I couldn't escape the feeling that she was still out there, watching. And every time I hear a soft voice in a crowded room, every time someone smiles just a little too wide, I wonder if it's her. What did I see, and what did she know that I didn't? I guess I'll never know, but I can't shake the thought that I'm still being watched. And I can't stop thinking about that whisper, those words that still echo in my mind. You saw it, didn't you? It's weird how something can feel completely off but still seem totally fine at the same time. That was my first date with her, Maria. It was going great. Everything seemed like it was falling into place. The laughs, the awkward pauses, even the little bits of silence were comfortable. I'm not saying it was perfect, but it felt easy. But that's when it started to feel strange. We went to this little cafe down the street from where I live. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was the kind of place you walk into and immediately feel like you've been there 100 times before. You know the kind, the soft jazz music in the background, the dim lighting, and the smell of strong coffee and baked goods. The kind of place that gives you that cozy, almost nostalgic feeling. I guess that's what made it feel so comfortable. Maria and I had met a few days before at a friend's party. It's weird how we hit it off almost instantly, laughing at the same jokes, finding common ground about random stuff like TV shows, movies, and dumb things we both did as kids. By the end of the night, she gave me her number, and we agreed we'd meet up again. Nothing fancy, just some casual coffee. No pressure. At first, I didn't think anything was weird. We talked about the usual stuff, how the weather's been, what we'd been up to, and what kind of things we like to do in our spare time. It was just a typical first date. But then, something happened. We got to the part where we started talking about our work, and that's when it hit me. Her job? It sounded exactly like mine. I mean, exactly like mine. Same position, same company, same weird office politics. The details were too similar to be a coincidence. But here's the kicker. The job she described wasn't just familiar because I work in the same field. It was identical to the job I'd been doing a week before, down to the exact projects we were working on. It was bizarre. I asked her about a few specifics, stuff that only someone in the same line of work would understand, and she gave me the same answers I would have given. It was almost as if she had been reading my thoughts, like she knew exactly what I would say before I said it. But here's the thing. I knew I hadn't told her any of this. We hadn't even talked about our jobs when we met for the first time. I was starting to feel like I'd missed something, like I was forgetting something really important, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it, so I just let it slide and kept talking. She smiled and nodded, seemed genuinely interested, and her laugh was cute. It made me feel a little better. I tried to focus on her, tried to enjoy the conversation. We moved on to talking about movies, and that's when I started to get that feeling. You know the one, like you've heard this conversation before. It wasn't just that it felt familiar, it was like I was remembering it, word for word. She made a joke about an old movie that I had seen 100 times, and I found myself smiling before she even finished the sentence. That's when the first real wave of déjà vu hit me. I mean, I literally remembered this exact moment, the exact joke, the way she laughed, the way I responded. It was the same, the exact same. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My mind started racing. I glanced down at my phone. The date was the same as last week, the same exact day, same time. I opened up my calendar just to be sure, and there it was, last week, this exact cafe, same time. What the hell was going on? I looked at Maria again, and that's when I felt like the world around me shifted. It wasn't just her that felt familiar, it was everything. The cafe, the way the coffee tasted, the texture of the table beneath my hands. I had been here before, and the worst part? It didn't feel like I was in some kind of strange dream or some weird time loop where everything was blurry. It felt real. The conversation felt real. Her smile felt real. But it also felt like something I couldn't quite escape from. Something I'd been stuck in before. I'm not crazy, I know that. But this was something else. I stared at my phone for a moment longer, and everything started spinning. The exact conversation we were having was the same one we'd had last week. Same questions, same answers, same tone. There was no way this could be a coincidence. There was no way I could be imagining this. "Are you okay?" Maria asked me, and it snapped me out of my thoughts. She looked genuinely concerned. But as I looked at her face, all I could feel was this overwhelming sense of wrongness. I didn't know if she was real. I didn't know if I was real. What if this whole thing had happened before? What if I had already lived this moment, already sat at this table and had this conversation 100 times? What if there was something I was missing, something that I wasn't supposed to see? It felt like the world was closing in on me. I couldn't breathe. Everything felt like it was on a loop, like I was stuck in the same moment, repeating over and over again. And no matter what I did, I couldn't break out of it. I tried to keep calm, tried to push the panic away. I smiled, maybe a little too widely, and nodded. "Yeah, I'm fine." But my voice felt distant, like it wasn't really mine. I couldn't focus anymore. I kept thinking back to what had happened last week. We had gone on the same date, same place, same cafe. I knew I had been here, I knew it. But why couldn't I remember how it had ended? My mind kept racing, trying to piece together the timeline. Had I walked out? Had something happened? Why couldn't I remember the last part of the night? I looked down at my phone again. It was almost like I was hoping that if I kept staring at it long enough, something would change. Maybe the world would shift back into place and I could pretend this wasn't happening. But when I looked back up, everything was the same. Maria was sitting there, looking at me with that same concerned expression. And the cafe around me was the same. The conversations were the same. I started to feel dizzy. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. I had to get out of there. I had to leave. But as I stood up, Maria followed me, still asking if I was okay. The feeling of déjà vu was suffocating now, and I couldn't get out of it. It was like I was caught in some kind of loop, some sick version of the same night playing over and over again, and no matter what I did, I couldn't break out of it. My feet moved before I even realized it, carrying me out of the cafe and into the street. The air outside felt crisp, but it didn't help. My mind was still locked in that loop, still trapped in the same conversation with her, the same damn date. I looked at her one last time, and for a moment, I didn't recognize her. It was like I had never met her before, even though I knew I had. I turned around and started walking, faster now. I couldn't think. My mind was racing, and all I could hear was the sound of my own footsteps louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. I didn't look back, but the whole time one thought kept repeating in my head. Had I ever really left that cafe? Had I ever really gotten out of that loop? Or was I just doomed to repeat it over and over again? I kept walking. Maybe if I didn't stop, maybe if I just kept moving, the world would stop spinning. I don't know, but as I kept putting one foot in front of the other, I tried to ignore the feeling gnawing at the back of my mind, the sickening feeling that I was stuck, that I had always been stuck in that moment, forever caught in a loop I couldn't escape. The streetlights flickered, the noise of the city seemed muffled as my thoughts filled my head, and everything around me felt distant, like I wasn't really there, like I was moving through a dream. I glanced around at the buildings, at the people walking by, but it all felt so unreal. Even the air felt wrong. Like I could taste the memories of things I hadn't even experienced yet. It was like déjà vu on overdrive. I couldn't even trust my own thoughts anymore. How much of this was real? How much of it had already happened, or was about to happen again? The question kept repeating itself in my head, louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. Was I doomed to live the same day over and over again? Would I see Maria again tomorrow, only to go through the same awkward conversation? Would it be the same cafe, the same jokes, the same confusion? And as I walked, the worst part hit me. I was never going to know. I thought I was going crazy. I don't know how else to explain it. Everything about that night felt off from the start. Not in a way that was immediately obvious, but something in my gut kept telling me to watch out. I should have listened to it. It started pretty normal. I met Deland through a dating app. We'd exchanged a few messages, and after a few days, we finally agreed to meet in person. We picked a cozy little cafe downtown. Nothing too fancy, the kind of place where you could sit back and talk without worrying about the noise or crowded tables. I'd been looking forward to it, hoping that maybe this time I'd meet someone decent. I showed up a bit early just in case, but he wasn't there yet. So I grabbed a seat near the window and started scrolling through my phone, killing time. After about 10 minutes, I saw him walk in. He was tall, with dark hair and a smile that seemed too eager. I stood up, waved, and he waved back with this weird kind of relief on his face, like he'd been waiting for me too. We ordered drinks, coffee for me, black tea for him, and started chatting. The conversation was easy at first. We talked about the usual things, jobs, where we grew up, our favorite movies. It was all casual, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, I started noticing something strange. He kept checking his phone, not in a subtle way either. It wasn't just a quick glance, like we all do when we're waiting for an important text or notification. No, he'd pull it out, scroll through something for a while, then tap his screen a few times and put it back. This wasn't one of those "I'm just checking the time" moments. It was way too frequent. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was waiting for an urgent call or message, who knows? I thought I was just overthinking it. But as the minutes passed, the behavior started to feel weird. He wasn't texting anyone. I didn't see him replying to any messages. He was just tapping, looking down, and then putting the phone away. It was starting to distract me from the conversation, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to it. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I tried to make a joke to lighten the mood. "So who keeps texting you? You've been checking your phone like every 5 minutes. He looked up at me, a little surprised, but quickly put his phone face down on the table. I didn't think much of it, figuring I had just caught him off guard. Maybe he was embarrassed or didn't want to talk about it. But then, a few more minutes passed, and he did it again. Same thing, he looked at his phone, tapped it a couple of times, then slid it back into his pocket like it was no big deal. This time, I didn't let it slide. I laughed nervously, trying to joke around. "You know, it's kind of rude to keep checking your phone on a date, right?" He froze. There was a pause, like he wasn't sure what to say. He didn't look mad or irritated, just kind of blank. Then, without saying anything, he pulled the phone out again and showed it to me. The screen was lit up, and I could see the caller ID clearly. It said, "Home." I didn't understand what was going on at first. The screen just displayed "Home," with no other explanation. No phone number, no name, nothing. Just that. The odd part was that there was no message or notification, just an ongoing call. But what really creeped me out was the fact that the call had been going on for the entire time we'd been sitting there, since we first sat down. A steady, ongoing call with no one saying anything on the other end. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to say something or if he was trying to make a joke, but everything about it felt wrong. I looked up at his face, and I saw something in his eyes, something strange. It wasn't guilt or embarrassment, not even confusion. It was like resignation, like he had been expecting me to ask, expecting me to see. I couldn't speak. I just stared at the phone, trying to make sense of it. I don't know why I didn't leave right then and there. I should have, but I stayed. Maybe because I thought it was some weird misunderstanding, or maybe because I was too shocked to react. "So, that's been going on the whole time?" I finally managed to ask. But I didn't really care about the answer at that point. I needed to know why it felt so wrong. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just stared at the phone for a second before turning it face down again, pushing it toward me. "It's nothing. Just some people checking in." I didn't buy it. It didn't feel like nothing. The whole thing made me uneasy, but I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid, so I tried to brush it off. But the phone kept buzzing a little bit, almost like a faint vibration under the table. I could feel it even when it wasn't visible. It felt like the call was watching us, waiting. The rest of the conversation was a blur. I remember us talking about random things, trying to pretend like it was a normal date, but it felt like I wasn't really there, like I was just playing a part. Every time he picked up the phone again or tapped it or glanced at it, I felt this knot in my stomach. Something wasn't right. As the night dragged on, I found myself looking at the door, mentally counting down the minutes until I could leave. I made small talk, but I kept my eyes on the phone, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread building in me. The phone vibrated again, louder this time. He didn't seem to care. At some point, I realized I wasn't even listening to him anymore. I was just fixated on that phone, the call, the fact that the screen still read home, and that no one was talking on the other end. The weirdest part was that it didn't even seem like anyone was waiting for him to pick up. No one was demanding his attention. It was just there. Eventually, I decided I'd had enough. The conversation was dead in the water. I made an excuse about needing to get home early, stood up and grabbed my coat. He didn't protest. He just nodded and stood up too, following me to the door. I was almost relieved that the night was ending. I thought maybe I could shake it off, pretend like nothing happened, and move on. But as I stepped outside, he did something I wasn't expecting. He pulled out his phone one last time, stared at it for a moment, and then, without a word, he turned it to show me again. The screen still said home, but this time the call had ended. The call had been going on for hours, but as I looked at the screen, I saw the truth. The call wasn't coming from someone waiting at home. It wasn't coming from a friend, a family member, or some random caller. The call had been made to him, by himself. It was his own number listed as home. I don't know how to explain it, but the minute I saw that, I knew. It wasn't some strange mistake or tech glitch. It wasn't a prank. It was something much worse, something I couldn't even put into words. I don't know what kind of game he was playing or what kind of person he was. All I know is that I've never heard from him again, not once. And honestly, I don't ever want to. The memory of that night never really left me. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was always in the back of my mind, no matter what I did. I had to ask myself, was I just imagining things? Was I overreacting? Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation. Maybe it was all a weird coincidence, some bizarre mix-up. But then again, every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the phone screen, the words home glaring back at me, and the quiet, unsettling call that never really ended. I still can't shake the feeling that I was part of something I wasn't meant to understand, that the whole night had been some kind of test or setup. Maybe he was seeing how long I would stay before I caught on. Maybe it was just a game for him. Whatever it was, I was glad it ended when it did. I haven't heard from Delon since that night. And you know what? I'm perfectly fine with that. I can't even bring myself to think about what would have happened if I had stayed longer, or if I had asked more questions. Part of me thinks that if I had, maybe I would have been stuck in whatever strange, twisted situation he was in. I don't know what kind of person could live like that, knowing they're calling themselves from some hidden, invisible place. But I'm sure as hell glad I didn't stick around to find out. I can't forget that night. I wish I could, but the images and sounds are still so vivid, and every time I close my eyes, I'm back there again. I never thought a simple date could turn into something so terrifying, but here we are. I should have known better. I should have trusted that feeling deep in my gut that told me something was wrong. But, of course, I didn't. Now all I have left is the memory of that night, the sound of knocking, and the basement door. It all started so innocently, like any other date. I met Greg online. We'd been texting for a week or so, and he seemed really nice. He was funny, charming, a little quiet at first, but overall easy to talk to. He suggested meeting up, and I agreed. He lived a bit outside the city, but not too far. A small, older house with a big yard, the kind you see in the outskirts of town, where things are just a little quieter than the city. It looked nice enough from the outside. Not exactly the type of place that would raise any red flags, at least not at first glance. When I arrived, Greg greeted me at the door with a warm smile and invited me inside. The house was quiet, too quiet actually. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the kind of silence that felt like something was being hidden, something you weren't meant to hear. It wasn't an alarming feeling, not yet, but it was enough to make me pause. "Come on in," he said. I followed him inside, trying to shake off the unease creeping up on me. The living room was sparse. It wasn't a huge space, but it was still odd. The furniture was modern, clean, but there were no pictures, no decorations, nothing to make it feel lived in. It almost felt like a show home, like he had just moved in and hadn't bothered to put his own touch on it. There was a coffee table in the center, a few couches, and a flat-screen TV on the wall. but that was it. I smiled, trying to act casual. I told him the house was nice, and he led me toward the kitchen. "You want something to drink?" he asked. I nodded, sitting down at the kitchen table while he prepared us both a glass of water. The kitchen wasn't anything special, just a small space with older appliances. But then, as I sat there, my eyes caught something down the hallway. Something I hadn't noticed before. A door. The basement door. Now, don't get me wrong, basements aren't anything strange. Every house has one. But there was something about this door that struck me as off. It wasn't just any door. It had what looked like a dozen heavy-duty locks on it. Each lock was big and metallic, the kind that made a loud click when they snapped into place. The door didn't have a doorknob, just a handle, and those locks kept it shut tight. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. I don't know why, but my eyes kept going back to it. Greg noticed me staring. "That door leads to the basement," he said casually, as if it were no big deal. But then he added something that immediately made my blood run cold. "It's best if you don't ask about it." I wasn't sure what to say. I mean, what do you even say to something like that? Okay, sure. Don't ask about it sounded strange, to say the least. But as uncomfortable as it made me, I brushed it off. Maybe he had a weird thing about basements, I thought. People are allowed their quirks, right? The conversation shifted, and we moved on with our evening. We watched a movie, just a casual one, nothing too serious. The whole time, though, I couldn't stop thinking about that door. And those locks. I couldn't get it out of my head. It felt like it was staring at me, like I was supposed to notice it. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was important, like it meant something. When the movie ended, Greg offered to show me around the house. We walked upstairs to the second floor, which looked just as unremarkable as the first. The guest room was simple but cozy, and Greg showed me where the bathroom was. Then, we sat down for a bit, talking, but my mind kept wandering back to that basement door. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. He offered for me to stay over, and at the time, I didn't think much of it. I wasn't planning on it, but the night had gone well enough, so I agreed. He showed me to the guest room, and everything seemed normal. I laid down on the bed, the silence of the house pressing in around me. But that's when I first started to feel it. The strange, unshakable feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't loud, but the silence felt wrong. Like something was missing. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like there was an unseen presence just outside of my awareness. But I told myself I was being paranoid and tried to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night. The house was dead silent, save for the faint sound of something. Knocking. Slow, heavy knocks. It wasn't the kind of knocking you hear from a door, but more like something banging against the walls. Soft at first, like it was coming from far away, but then it got louder, more distinct. The knocks were methodical, deliberate. 1, T2, T3. A pause, then another knock. I held my breath, straining to hear, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But no, the knocking continued. It was coming from downstairs, from the direction of that basement door. I didn't move at first. I lay there frozen, my mind racing, trying to figure out what was happening. The knocks weren't random, they were too slow, too rhythmic, as if someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. It was the kind of sound that made my heart pound in my chest, each knock sending a cold wave of dread through me. I told myself it was just the house settling, just the wind moving outside. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. The knocking didn't feel like that. It felt controlled, intentional. I didn't know what to do. Should I go downstairs? Check on it? Or should I just pretend I didn't hear anything and hope it would stop? The fear started to settle deep in my stomach, cold and heavy. I wasn't sure if I was scared of the knocking itself or of what might be on the other side of that basement door. I couldn't imagine what could be down there, locked away with all those bolts. The knocking stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the silence was even worse. I lay there in the dark, my heart still racing. Then, just as I was starting to think it was over, I heard something else. Footsteps, slow, uneven steps, heavy steps, like someone was walking down the hall, dragging their feet with each movement. I held my breath again, straining to hear. The footsteps came closer, closer to the guest room door. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, the dread settling deeper into my bones. The house felt different now, like something had shifted, like I wasn't alone anymore. I waited, paralyzed with fear, but the footsteps never came closer. They stopped just outside the door. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting, but eventually the sound of footsteps faded. The house went completely still. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. In the morning, everything seemed normal again. The knocking, the footsteps, they were gone, as if they had never happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to leave as soon as I could. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I didn't want to stick around to find out. When Greg came in to check on me, he was his usual friendly self, but I couldn't bring myself to stay any longer. I made some excuse about needing to head home, grabbed my things, and left. Greg didn't question me, just waved goodbye. I haven't seen him since that night, and honestly, I don't want to. I still can't get the sound of those knocks out of my head. And every time I think about that basement door, I wonder what's behind it. What was it that Greg didn't want me to ask about? What was locked away down there? I don't know the answers, and I don't think I ever will, but I do know one thing. I'll never forget the sound of the knocking, and I'll never, ever forget that door. I've always been a little skeptical when it comes to first dates. Maybe it's the pressure to make everything go perfectly, or maybe it's the fear of embarrassing myself, but for some reason, I find them nerve-wracking. So, when I matched with someone on a dating app, and we agreed to meet up at a cozy coffee shop, I tried to keep things low-key. Nothing fancy, just two people meeting for the first time. Simple enough, right? I arrived a little early, maybe to avoid that awkward I don't know who you are moment when we both show up at the same time. The coffee shop was quiet, the smell of roasted beans filling the air. It wasn't crowded, which was a relief. There was something peaceful about the place. Dim lighting, soft indie music playing in the background, and only a few other people scattered around the room. It had an almost comforting atmosphere, perfect for a first date. I found a table near the back and sat down, checking my phone. I didn't want to be the guy who stared at his phone the whole time, but I couldn't help it. I was nervous. I glanced around the room and noticed a woman sitting in the corner, in one of the big armchairs by the window. She was alone. At first, I didn't pay her much attention. She was just another person enjoying a drink, or so I thought. But as I sat there, I couldn't help but notice something strange. She wasn't moving. She was sitting perfectly still. Completely still. She wasn't checking her phone, wasn't flipping through a book, wasn't even tapping her fingers on the table. She was just sitting there, grinning. I figured she was either lost in thought or maybe just staring out the window. No big deal, right? But as time passed, it started to feel off. It wasn't just that she was sitting still. It was the way she was smiling. The grin stretched across her face, way too wide, like it was frozen in place, and she wasn't blinking. Not once. It was like she was some weird mannequin or a person who had forgotten how to move. It wasn't normal. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe she was just one of those people who liked to be different. Maybe she was shy, or maybe she was some kind of social experiment. Who knows? But as my date arrived and sat down across from me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in the corner was watching us. I was having a hard time focusing on the conversation. Every time I looked up, there she was, still grinning at me. It wasn't a malicious smile, but there was something unsettling about it. It almost felt like she knew something I didn't, like she was waiting for something. I tried to focus on my date, whose name I'd already forgotten, to be honest. I wasn't in the best state of mind, but no matter how hard I tried, my eyes would drift back to her. The woman in the corner. She never moved, never blinked, never shifted. Just that eerie smile. At one point, I was mid-sentence, telling some half-baked joke, when I caught a glimpse of her again. My gaze lingered a little too long, and I started to feel like I was losing track of the conversation. I snapped back to reality, but the woman in the corner was still there, smiling, watching. It got to the point where I couldn't focus on my date anymore. My attention was completely stolen by this woman. My palms started to sweat. Was she real? Maybe she was a figment of my imagination. It felt like I was in some weird, surreal moment, caught between this world and some other place. Finally, after what felt like hours, my date leaned in slightly, her eyes following mine. "Who keeps staring at you?" she asked, a small frown on her face. She had noticed, and I felt caught. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain. Was I going to sound crazy? I didn't want to sound like some guy who freaked out over nothing, but I couldn't stop looking at her. I pointed to the corner where the woman was sitting, still in her chair, still with that eerie, frozen grin plastered on her face. But the chair was empty. I blinked, confused. I stared at the corner, half expecting her to suddenly pop up, but there was no one there. Just the empty chair. I turned back to my date, and she was looking at me like I had just grown another head. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice calm but confused. I looked back at the chair again, my heart racing. Where did she go? Had I imagined her? I glanced around the room. No one was sitting in that corner anymore. The spot was completely empty, and now it seemed like I had just pointed at thin air. I felt dizzy, like I had stepped out of reality for a second. I looked around again, trying to make sense of what just happened. Was I losing my mind? Maybe I had misinterpreted the whole thing, but I could have sworn she was just there, staring at me. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. I must have imagined it. Sorry about that, I said. But even I didn't believe my own words. My date gave me a strange look but nodded, though I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced by my explanation. But it wasn't over. The unease hadn't lifted, not by a long shot. The woman, whoever she was, had disappeared, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was something about the way the air in the room felt heavier now, thicker. I couldn't help but feel that she was still watching me, that she was still here somehow. Maybe she hadn't left at all. My date and I finished our drinks in awkward silence. I was doing my best to ignore the creeping sense of dread, but every time I glanced around the room, I half expected to see her standing behind me or sitting in another chair watching. But the worst part was that I couldn't stop wondering what it all meant. Who was she? Why was she staring at me so intensely, so unmoving? Was it some kind of message, or was I losing my mind? We eventually left, and I felt the tension slowly lift as we walked outside. The night air felt cool against my skin, a contrast to the heat of the coffee shop, but even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that I had just been part of something far stranger than I was willing to admit. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night. Did I hallucinate the whole thing? Was it just a weird coincidence, a trick of the mind? All I know is that I haven't been back to that coffee shop since, and every time I pass it, I can't help but wonder if I'll ever see her again. That woman, the one with the smile, the one who never moved. I'd like to think I'm not a paranoid person. I mean, I check my doors before bed, sure, but who doesn't? It's the kind of thing you do to feel secure, even if you know it's probably unnecessary. But after that night, after that date, I'm not so sure anymore. It all started with a simple online match. You know the drill. Swiping through profiles, chatting for a few days, and then you agree to meet up. We settled on a casual dinner at this dimly lit Italian place on the edge of town. Not too fancy, but nice enough for a first date. Her name was Jess, and she seemed sweet enough from our conversations. She had a way of texting that made her sound approachable, down to earth. So I figured, why not? It could be fun. I showed up first like I usually do, to make sure I had a good seat. I wasn't exactly in a rush. I sat down at a table by the window, my fingers tapping on the edge of my phone as I checked the time. The place wasn't packed, but there were a few people scattered around. It had that warm, cozy vibe, with the smell of garlic in the air and soft Italian music playing in the background. A few minutes later, I saw her walk in. She looked pretty much like her pictures, dark hair, green eyes, a nice smile. But something about her felt off. Maybe it was the way she smiled a little too quickly, or how her eyes seemed to catch the light in a way that made them almost unnaturally bright. I shook it off. It was just first date nerves, right? She sat down, and for the first few minutes the conversation flowed like any other. We talked about work, about hobbies, the usual stuff. But then, as we moved on to more personal topics, I started noticing something strange. It wasn't what she was saying so much as how she was saying it. She started talking about things I hadn't told her. Personal things, things I'd never shared with anyone. At first, it was subtle, small details. "You must love those late-night runs," she said, referring to how I'd started jogging again recently. But how did she know about that? I hadn't posted anything online about it, and it wasn't something I'd mentioned to her. She also knew about a trip I had planned, even down to the dates, which I hadn't mentioned to anyone. "Your favorite pizza place is on 5th, right?" she asked at one point. I froze. I had never told her where my favorite place was. I barely even mentioned it to my closest friends. It was a little hole in the wall joint I went to whenever I needed to clear my head, a spot I'd kept to myself. But she knew about it. The more we talked, the more I realized she was getting these details right, one after another, and it was creeping me out. I tried to brush it off as coincidence. Maybe she had seen a social media post, or overheard me talking to a friend. But no, she was digging into things I hadn't shared. "Do you remember that bar on Pine Street where you once bumped into that guy from your old job?" she asked with a little laugh. "You were wearing a blue shirt, and you looked so embarrassed." I didn't even know I'd been wearing a blue shirt, let alone that I'd bumped into anyone. And that had been months ago, a night I'd completely forgotten about until she mentioned it. By this point, my gut was twisting in a way that I couldn't ignore. My palms were sweating, and my voice had dropped a little as I tried to keep the conversation going. But every word she spoke felt like it was coming from a place that I didn't recognize. I laughed nervously and tried to play it off. "How do you know all that?" I asked, smiling to cover the unease. I tried to keep it light, but there was a flicker of doubt creeping into my thoughts. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she leaned forward, her smile widening. There was something in her eyes then, something dark, almost predatory. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You've noticed, haven't you?" she said, her voice dropping to a soft whisper. "Everything feels familiar, like we've done this before." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I already had a sinking feeling about where this was going. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned in closer, her breath warm on my ear. The restaurant around us seemed to fade for a second, like it was just the two of us in some strange, isolated space. "I've been watching you for a long, long time," she whispered. My blood ran cold. I couldn't even move. My mouth went dry, and I could feel my pulse in my ears, beating louder than the music or the chatter of other diners. I stared at her, trying to understand if this was some kind of joke, but she wasn't laughing. I forced a smile, but I could feel the panic creeping into my chest. I excused myself to go to the bathroom, but I wasn't sure what I was doing. I just needed to get out of there for a moment. The air in the room felt thick, like I was suffocating. As I stood at the bathroom mirror, I tried to steady myself, taking deep breaths. I had to get out. Something was wrong. I went back to the table, trying to act like everything was fine, but the night had already taken a turn I didn't know how to fix. Jess was still sitting there, her eyes locked onto me like she was studying me, waiting for something. My mind was racing, but I couldn't think straight. She wasn't supposed to know all these things. She wasn't supposed to have this information. I decided I had to leave. I didn't care how rude it seemed. I wasn't staying in that restaurant any longer. I made my excuses and stood up, almost knocking my chair over in the process. Jess didn't stop me. She just sat there, smiling that same wide grin. I could feel her eyes on my back as I walked away. When I stepped outside, the night air hit me like a slap to the face, and I felt a rush of relief. I'd made it out. I didn't look back. But as I walked toward my car, I had this horrible feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, expecting to see her standing there, watching me from the doorway. But there was no one there. I don't know what I expected to happen next, but I do know one thing. I never went back to that restaurant. I never contacted Jess again, and I haven't gone on a date since. I've spent the last few months wondering if I was just overreacting, if I misread the whole thing, but the more I think about it, the more certain I am of one thing. Jess knew things about me that no one should have known, and I don't know how she knew. I don't know if she's still watching, but sometimes, when I check the locks on my door late at night, I can't shake the feeling that someone's out there, watching, waiting.